The great chamber was silent. Daniel Carter stood alone in the center of the massive room, surrounded by creatures from a dozen different worlds. Above him, seated on platforms that rose like a staircase to the ceiling, the 12 elder species of the Galactic Council looked down with cold eyes. Daniel was 42 years old. He had spent 15 years working his way up through Earth's diplomatic service. He had believed in cooperation. He had believed that humanity could find its place among the stars. Now he understood how foolish that belief had been. The Velnorian High Chancellor floated forward on his platform. His body was made of living crystal, and light bent strangely around him as he moved. His name was Vornis, and he had ruled the Council for 300 years. To him, humans were nothing more than clever animals who had learned to build spaceships. Vornis spoke in a voice like breaking glass. He announced that the Council had reached its decision regarding the human species and their violations of galactic law. Daniel said nothing. He already knew what was coming. Behind him in the gallery reserved for observers, his wife Lisa sat with their son Kevin. The boy was only 14, but he was old enough to understand what was happening. Lisa held his hand tightly, her face pale but calm. She had always been the stronger one. Vornis continued reading from the official document. Humanity stood accused of unauthorized technological advancement. They had developed faster-than-light engines without Council approval. They had expanded into 7 star systems in just 50 years. They had traded with species outside the approved list. They had shown disrespect for the natural order of galactic civilization. Daniel wanted to laugh. The natural order. That was what they called it when the elder species kept everyone else weak and dependent. For 10,000 years, the Council had controlled who could build what ships, who could settle which planets, who could trade with whom. Any species that grew too strong was cut down. Any species that asked too many questions was silenced. Humanity had refused to be silenced. That was their real crime. The Kishari ambassador shifted in his seat. The Kishari were a reptilian species who had joined the Council only 2 centuries ago. Daniel had thought they might support humanity. He had been wrong. The Kishari had learned to play by the Council's rules. They had no interest in helping troublemakers. Vornis finished reading the charges and moved on to the sentence. Complete exile, he declared. The human species would be stripped of all trading rights and galactic protections. Their colonies in Council space would be seized. Their ships would be confiscated. They would be given 30 days to gather their people and leave. Daniel asked where they were supposed to go. Vornis made a sound that might have been laughter. He said the Council was not without mercy. Humanity would be permitted to settle in the Outer Rim. A murmur went through the chamber. Even some of the Council members seemed surprised. The Outer Rim was the most dangerous region of the galaxy. It was a place of radiation storms, unstable stars, and cosmic anomalies that could tear a ship apart without warning. Hundreds of species had been sent there over the millennia. None had survived more than a few generations. Lisa closed her eyes. Kevin's hands curled into fists. Daniel looked up at the Council. He looked at Vornis and the other elder species who had ruled the galaxy for so long. They were not evil, he realized. They were simply afraid. Humanity had risen too fast. In just 3 centuries, humans had gone from primitive tribes to interstellar travelers. Given another 1,000 years, they might surpass even the eldest species. The Council could not allow that, so they would send humanity to die in the darkness between stars. And they would tell themselves it was justice. The guards moved forward to escort Daniel from the chamber. They were Dramani, 8-foot-tall beings with forearms and skin like gray stone. They had served the Council for 5,000 years. They did not think. They simply obeyed. Daniel walked calmly between them. But at the door, he stopped and turned back. The chamber fell silent again. Even Vornis paused, curious despite himself. Daniel spoke clearly so that everyone could hear. He told them that humanity accepted the Council's judgment. They would leave Council space. They would go to the Outer Rim. But he wanted the Council to remember this moment. He wanted them to remember the day they threw humanity away like garbage. Vornis asked if that was a threat. Daniel shook his head. He said it was a promise. He told them that one day humanity would return. And when that day came, the council would understand the mistake they had made. The elder species laughed. The sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. Even some of the younger species joined in. The idea that exiled humans could ever threaten the Galactic Council was absurd. It was the funniest thing they had heard in centuries. Daniel did not smile. He simply turned and walked out. Lisa and Kevin were waiting in the corridor outside. Lisa embraced him, and for a moment Daniel allowed himself to feel the fear and grief he had been hiding. Everything they had built was gone. Earth's colonies, their trading networks, their place in galactic civilization. All of it had been taken away with a few words from beings who saw humans as nothing more than pests. Kevin looked up at his father. The boy's eyes were dry, but there was something burning behind them. He asked if they were really going to survive in the Outer Rim. Daniel put his hand on his son's shoulder. He said he did not know. But he knew that humanity would not simply lie down and die. They had survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly destroyed them. They had climbed out of darkness before. They would do it again. The journey back to Earth took 2 weeks. By the time they arrived, the news had already spread across every human world. People reacted with anger, with fear, with despair. Some refused to believe it. Others demanded that Earth's government fight back, but there was nothing to fight with. The Council's fleet outnumbered humanity's ships 1,000 to 1. Their weapons were more advanced. Their resources were limitless. A war would mean extinction. So humanity began to prepare for exile. Ships were loaded with supplies, equipment, and as many people as they could carry. Scientists gathered every piece of knowledge they could find. Engineers stripped the colonies of anything useful before the Council, arrived to claim them. Daniel worked without rest for the entire 30 days. He organized the evacuation, coordinated with other human leaders, and tried to keep hope alive, even when everything seemed hopeless. On the last day, he stood on the observation deck of the transport ship that would carry his family to the Outer Rim. Behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among millions. Lisa stood beside him. She asked if he really believed what he had told the Council. Did he really think humanity would return? Daniel watched the stars. He said he had to believe it. Because if he stopped believing, then the Council had already won. The ship jumped too faster than light speed, and Earth disappeared. Ahead of them lay the Outer Rim, a place of death and darkness where no species had ever survived. But humanity was not like other species. And the Council was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The Outer Rim was everything the Council had promised. It was cold. It was dark. It was death waiting around every corner. 3 years had passed since the exile. 20 billion humans had made the journey to this forsaken corner of the galaxy. Now, only 18 billion remained. 2 billion people had died from radiation sickness, equipment failures, starvation, and 100 other dangers that no one had expected. Commander Laura Mitchell stood on the bridge of the Wanderer, one of the few military ships that had survived the journey. She was 51 years old, with short gray hair and eyes that had seen too much death. Before the exile, she had commanded Earth's defensive fleet. Now she commanded a collection of broken ships held together by hope and desperation. Her communication officer reported that another settlement had gone dark. Colony 7 on the moon they called Haven. 300,000 people, gone without a trace. Laura closed her eyes for a moment. Then she ordered a rescue team to investigate. Even though she already knew what they would find, the Outer Rim was full of things that killed without warning. Radiation bursts from unstable stars, gravity wells that appeared from nowhere and crushed ships like insects, strange energy fields that drove people mad before killing them. The Council had known exactly what they were doing when they sent humanity here, but humanity refused to die. Daniel Carter had set up the central government on a station, orbiting a dying red star. They called it Last Light, a dark joke that had somehow become official. From there, he coordinated the scattered human settlements and tried to keep civilization from falling apart completely. He was meeting with his core advisors when Laura's report came in. Chief Engineer Ryan Torres, a thin man with nervous hands and brilliant eyes, was explaining his latest discovery, Dr. Samantha Blake. the leading expert on human biology and adaptation, sat beside him with a tablet full of data. Ryan said he had figured out how to use the energy fields that were killing their ships. The fields were not random, he explained. They were patterns like rivers of power flowing through the rim. If they could learn to read those patterns, they could tap into energy sources more powerful than anything in council space. Daniel asked how long it would take. Ryan admitted he did not know. Maybe years, maybe decades, but it was possible. That was enough. Daniel told him to keep working. Samantha spoke next. She had been studying the humans who survived longest in the rim. There were genetic markers, she said, that made some people more resistant to radiation and environmental stress. She believed she could develop treatments that would help everyone adapt. Daniel nodded. He told her to do whatever she needed. The work continued day after day, month after month. People died, but new children were born. Settlements failed, but new ones were built. Slowly, painfully, humanity learned how to survive in a place designed to destroy them. Kevin Carter, now 17, had joined the defense force under Laura's command. He was young, but he had inherited his father's determination and his mother's quiet strength. Laura recognized something special in him and took him under her guidance. The first major breakthrough came 18 months after the exile. Ryan's team successfully harnessed a rim energy stream to power an entire station. The energy output was 10 times greater than their old fusion reactors. When the news spread, people actually cheered for the first time since leaving Earth. The second breakthrough came 6 months later. Samantha completed her adaptation treatment. It was painful and took weeks to complete, but those who survived it became something more than ordinary humans. They could withstand radiation that would kill a normal person. They could go longer without food and water. They healed faster and thought clearer. Laura volunteered to be among the first. The treatment nearly killed her, but she emerged stronger than she had ever been. By the end of the 3rd year, humanity had stabilized. The death rate had dropped dramatically. New settlements were being established on worlds that should have been uninhabitable. Ships powered by rim energy moved faster and hit harder than anything the Council possessed. And then the pirates came. They were Drethni, a species of scavengers who lived on the edge of Council space. They had heard about the exiled humans and assumed they would be easy prey. A fleet of 30 ships jumped into human territory. Expecting to find helpless refugees, they found Laura Mitchell waiting for them. The battle lasted less than an hour. Laura's ships, upgraded with rim energy weapons, tore through the pirate fleet like fire through paper. Only 5 Drethni vessels escaped. They carried stories back to Council space about the humans who fought like demons and wielded weapons that burned hotter than stars. The raids stopped after that. Word spread among the Rim's other inhabitants that human space was not safe to attack. Daniel watched the battle reports with something he had not felt in 3 years: hope. They were not just surviving anymore. They were growing stronger. He called a meeting of all the human settlement leaders. Hundreds of faces appeared on screens around the chamber at last light. Daniel told them what they had accomplished. He told them about the energy technology and the genetic treatments and the military victories. Then he told them what came next. They were going to build an empire, not an empire of conquest, he explained. An empire of strength. They would create a civilization so powerful that no one would ever exile them again. They would develop technology the Council could not imagine. They would forge alliances with other species who had been abandoned or oppressed. They would become the greatest power the galaxy had ever seen. Some of the leaders were skeptical. They asked how long this would take. They asked if it was even possible. Daniel admitted he did not know. Maybe generations. Maybe centuries. But their children would continue the work, and their children's children after them. Humanity had always been good at playing the long game. The vote was unanimous. The human sovereignty was officially born. Lisa stood beside Daniel as the celebration began. She asked him if he really believed they could do this. Daniel watched the screens full of cheering faces. He said that 3 years ago, everyone believed they would die in the Rim. They had proven everyone wrong. Now they would do it again. In the darkness of the outer Rim, humanity began to build. They constructed shipyards and factories and research stations. They mapped the energy streams and learned to ride them like highways across the void. They welcomed refugees from other exiled species who came seeking shelter. The Galactic Council had forgotten about them. They assumed the humans had died years ago, as every other exiled species had died. They did not send scouts or spies. They did not watch the Outer Rim. That was their mistake. Because in the darkness, something was growing. Something that would one day return to Council space. Something that would change the galaxy forever. And at the heart of it all was Daniel Carter, the man they had tried to bury. The man who refused to die. The man who was turning exile into empire. 20 years had passed since the exile. The Galactic Council had not thought about humanity in a very long time. They had more important matters to consider. Trade disputes, border conflicts, the endless political games that kept the elder species in power. If they had looked toward the Outer Rim, they would have been terrified. Horizon Station hung in orbit around a star that burned with pale blue light. The station was massive, a wheel of metal and glass that stretched 50 kilometers across. 50 million people lived there, making it the largest human settlement in existence. But it was just one of hundreds. Daniel Carter stood on the observation deck, watching ships come and go from the station's ports. He was 63 now. His hair had turned white, and his face carried the lines of 2 decades of hard work. But his eyes were still sharp. His mind was still clear. The human sovereignty had grown beyond anything he had imagined. From the desperate refugees of 20 years ago, humanity had become a civilization that rivaled the Council itself. 400 billion people now lived under the sovereignty's protection, spread across 300 worlds and thousands of stations. And they were not alone. The Kishari had been the first to join. They were the reptilian species who had refused to help humanity during the trial. But when their own government became corrupt and oppressive, millions of Kishari fled to the Rim seeking refuge. The sovereignty welcomed them. Then came the Veth, a species of amphibians who had been conquered by the Council centuries ago. Then the Marani, the Tellan, the Draxi, and dozens of others. Some were refugees. Some were traitors. Some were simply curious about the strange humans who had survived the impossible. Daniel had given them all the same offer: join the sovereignty as equal partners. With full rights and representation, many accepted. Kevin Carter entered the observation deck. He was 34 now, tall and strong, with his mother's dark hair and his father's determined jaw. He wore the uniform of a sovereignty admiral, the highest rank in the military. Under his command were 3,000 warships and 2 million soldiers. He reported that the Ascendant was ready. Daniel smiled. He had been waiting to hear those words for 5 years. The Ascendant was the most powerful weapon humanity had ever built. It was a warship 3 kilometers long, powered by the largest Rim energy core ever constructed. Its weapons could crack a planet. Its shields could withstand the combined firepower of an entire Council fleet. It was not just a ship. It was a message. They walked together through the station's corridors, father and son. People stepped aside as they passed, nodding respectfully. Everyone knew Daniel Carter. He was the father of the sovereignty, the man who had led them through the darkest years. Admiral Laura Mitchell was waiting in the command center. She was 71 now, but the genetic treatments had kept her strong. Her hair was pure silver. Her eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had won 100 battles. She showed them the holographic display. 12 icons represented the Ascendant and its sister ships, the most powerful fleet ever assembled. Behind them were 300 other vessels, each one more advanced than anything the Council possessed. Laura said they were ready to move whenever. Daniel gave the order. Daniel studied the display. 20 years of work had led to this moment. 20 years of building, growing, preparing. His people had suffered and sacrificed to reach this point. They had earned the right to return. But he did not want to repeat the Council's mistakes. He did not want to build an empire based on fear and oppression. He wanted something better. Dr. Samantha Blake joined them. She was in her 60s now, the most respected scientist in the sovereignty. Her genetic research had transformed humanity. The children born in the Rim, the ones they called the new breed, were stronger, smarter, and longer lived than their ancestors. They were the future. Samantha reported that her intelligence network had finished their analysis. The council was weaker than it had been in centuries. The elder species were fighting among themselves. Corruption was everywhere. A dozen species were ready to rebel against council rule. Kevin suggested they could win a war easily. Their technology was superior. Their soldiers were better trained. They could crush the council and take control of the galaxy. Daniel shook his head. He said that was not the goal. They were not going to become the thing they had escaped. They would offer the council a choice: accept humanity as equals or face the consequences. If war came, they would fight. But they would not fire the first shot. Laura nodded. She had seen enough war in her life. She did not want more unless it was necessary. They spent hours planning the next steps. The sovereignty would reveal itself to the council and demand recognition. They would propose new treaties that gave all species equal rights. They would offer trade agreements that would benefit everyone, and if the council refused, they would show them what humanity had become. That night, Daniel sat alone in his quarters. Lisa had died 3 years ago, peacefully in her sleep. He still missed her every day. She had been his strength through the hardest times. She had believed in him when he doubted himself. He looked at her picture on his desk. He told her that they were almost there. Everything they had worked for was about to come true. The next morning, Daniel addressed the sovereignty. His face appeared on screens across human space and in the territories of their allies. Billions of people stopped what they were doing to listen. He told them that 20 years ago, the Galactic Council threw humanity away. They sent them to the Rim to die. They believed humans were weak. They believed humans would break. He paused, letting the words sink in. They were wrong, he continued. Humanity had not broken. They had built something greater than the Council had ever imagined. They had created a civilization based on merit, not birth, on cooperation, not domination, on hope, not fear. Now it was time to return. He announced that in 1 week. The human sovereignty would send a message to the Galactic Council. They would demand recognition. They would demand justice. And they would show the galaxy what happened when you underestimated humanity. Across the sovereignty, people cheered. After 20 years of waiting, the moment had finally arrived in his office. Kevin Carter looked at the star chart showing council space. Somewhere out there was the chamber where his father had been sentenced to exile. Somewhere out there were the species who had laughed at humanity's promise to return. They were not laughing anymore. The fleet began to move, heading toward the border between the Rim and council space. The Ascendant led the way, its massive hull catching the light of distant stars. Behind it came the rest of the Armada, a river of ships that stretched across the void. Humanity was coming home, and nothing in the galaxy could stop them. The message arrived without warning on every uncommunication screen in council space. Billions of beings across 1,000 worlds saw the same image at the same moment. A human man standing on the bridge of an enormous warship. Daniel Carter looked exactly as he had 25 years ago, except for the white hair and the lines on his face. He stood straight and calm, surrounded by officers in crisp uniforms. Behind him, through the massive windows of the bridge, stars wheeled slowly past. He greeted the Galactic Council simply and directly. He told them it had been a long time, 25 years to be exact. 25 years since they cast humanity into the Outer Rim to die. Across council space, people stopped what they were doing to watch. Some remembered the exile. Most had never heard of it. Humanity was ancient history, a minor footnote in galactic records. Daniel continued speaking. He explained that humanity had not died. They had survived. They had grown. And now they were ready to return. He provided coordinates for a neutral zone on the border between council space and the Rim. He invited the council to send representatives to discuss terms. He suggested they not keep humanity waiting too long. The transmission ended. For a long moment, there was silence across the galaxy. Then the chaos began. Chancellor Vornis, the Velnorian who had sentenced humanity to exile, called an emergency council session. He was 400 years old now, ancient even by Velnorian standards. His crystalline body had grown dull and cracked with age, but he still held power, and he still remembered the human who had promised to return. He had not believed that promise. He had been wrong. The council debated for 3 days. Some wanted to ignore the message. Humanity was bluffing, they said. No species could survive in the Outer Rim, let alone build a civilization there. Others wanted to send a fleet to investigate. A few suggested negotiating just to see what the humans actually wanted. In the end, curiosity won. Vornis himself would lead a delegation to meet the human representatives. He would show these upstart primates that the council was not impressed by their survival. He would put them in their place once and for all. The council fleet jumped to the coordinates Daniel had provided. 50 warships, the pride of the elder species, emerged from faster-than-light travel, expecting to find a handful of desperate refugees. They found Admiral Kevin Carter waiting for them. The human fleet filled the space around the neutral zone. 300 warships, each one larger and more advanced than anything the council possessed. At their center sat the Ascendant, a behemoth that dwarfed even the largest council vessel. Vornis stared at the display screens in disbelief. This was impossible. The Rim was supposed to be a death sentence. Humanity was supposed to be extinct. Kevin's face appeared on the communication screen. He welcomed the Chancellor to the border of the human sovereignty. He said they had been expecting him. The negotiations took place on a station specially built for the occasion. Kevin led the human delegation, flanked by representatives from the Kishari Veth and other species who had joined the sovereignty. Daniel watched from the Ascendant, ready to intervene if needed. Vornis arrived with his own delegation, ambassadors from the 12 elder species, who had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years. They walked into the meeting chamber expecting to dictate terms. They were in for a surprise. Kevin did not waste time with pleasantries. He presented the sovereignty's demands. First, full recognition of the human sovereignty as an independent power with equal standing to the council. Second, reparations for the exile, including the return of all seized human colonies and compensation for the lives lost. Third, 5 seats on the council itself with full voting rights. Vornis laughed. The sound was like glass breaking. He asked if the humans had lost their minds. They were a single species from a single world. They had no right to make demands of the Galactic Council. Kevin smiled and activated the holographic display. The image showed council space from above, a map of stars and worlds and trade routes. Scattered throughout the map were 300 red dots. Each represented a human warship that had slipped past council defenses completely undetected. They were positioned near key installations, major worlds, and strategic points throughout council territory. Kevin explained that those ships had been in place for 6 months. Council security had never noticed them. If the sovereignty wanted, they could cripple the council's infrastructure in a matter of hours. The chamber went silent. Kevin continued. The display changed to show economic data. Human trade networks now rivaled the council's own. Sovereignty technology was decades ahead of anything the elder species possessed. The genetic enhancements that had allowed humanity to survive the Rim had created soldiers who could outfight any other species in the galaxy. Then the display showed the alliance treaties. 47 species had pledged their support to the sovereignty. Some were former council members who had grown tired of elder species rule. Others were Rim dwellers who had found shelter with humanity. Together, they represented a coalition that could challenge the council on every front. Kevin looked directly at Vornis. He said these were not requests. They were terms. Humanity was not asking permission to return. They were informing the council that the galaxy had changed. Vornis tried to argue. He spoke of tradition, of the natural order, of the wisdom of the elder species. But his words sounded hollow even to his own delegation. The evidence was overwhelming. Humanity had done the impossible, and they had the power to back up their demands. The negotiations lasted a week. The council tried to bargain, to delay, to find some way to maintain their dominance. But Kevin held firm. He had learned from his father that strength was meaningless without the will to use it in the end. Ornis asked, "What would happen if the council refused?" Kevin answered simply. He said the sovereignty did not want war. They wanted justice. But if the council forced them to fight, they would fight, and they would win. He gave them 30 days to decide. The same amount of time the council had given humanity to prepare for exile. Then he stood and left the chamber. On the Ascendant, Daniel watched the recording of the negotiations. He felt pride in what his son had become. Kevin was a better leader than Daniel had ever been. He was strong, but not cruel, determined, but not reckless. Laura Mitchell joined him on the observation deck. She asked if he thought the council would accept the terms. Daniel shook his head. He said some of them might, but the elder species had ruled for too long. They could not imagine a galaxy where they were not in control. They would fight. Laura nodded. She had expected that answer. Her fleet was ready 20-5 years ago. Daniel had walked out of the council chamber and promised that humanity would return. The elder species had laughed at him. They had called it absurd. They had believed they were sending humanity to die. Now those same species stared at screens showing human warships and human soldiers and human war technology that surpassed their own. Now, they understood that the absurd promise had become reality. Humanity had returned, and the galaxy would never be the same. The council did not accept the terms. On the 29th day, Chancellor Vornis sent a message rejecting every demand. Humanity would receive nothing. The sovereignty would disband. Any human ships found in council space would be destroyed. Then the Velnorians and their closest allies launched a surprise attack. A fleet of 200 council warships jumped into sovereignty territory, targeting the border stations where Kevin's fleet was gathered. They expected to catch the humans off guard. They expected a quick victory that would restore the natural order of the actual galaxy. They were catastrophically wrong. Admiral Laura Mitchell had anticipated the attack. Her scouts had been watching council fleet movements for months. When the enemy ships appeared, the sovereignty forces were already in position. The Battle of the Border lasted 6 hours. It was the largest space engagement in galactic history. It was completely one-sided. The Ascendant led the human fleet into combat. Its rim energy weapons tore through council shields like they were made of paper. Beams of blue-white light cut across the void, turning enemy vessels into expanding clouds of debris. The Council's most advanced warships, vessels that had dominated galactic conflicts for centuries, were destroyed in minutes. Laura commanded from the bridge of her flagship, the Defiance. She was calm and precise, directing her forces with the skill of someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment. Her enhanced senses allowed her to process information faster than any normal human. Her enhanced body felt no fatigue even after hours of combat. When it was over, Council fleet had been reduced to a handful of fleeing ships. The Sovereignty had lost fewer than 20 vessels. Kevin contacted his father with the report. Daniel listened in silence, then gave the order to advance. The Sovereignty fleet moved into Council space. But this was not conquest in the traditional sense. Kevin had learned from history. He had studied the empires that rose and fell throughout human civilization. He understood that power maintained through fear alone never lasted. As human ships entered each system, they broadcast the same message. The old council was gone. A new order was being established. Any world that wished to join the sovereignty would be welcomed as an equal partner. Any world that wished to remain independent would be allowed to do so, with trade agreements available for mutual benefit. The response was overwhelming. Species that had chafed under council rule for generations saw an opportunity for change. Rebellions that had been brewing in secret finally exploded into the open. Within weeks, the council's authority collapsed across most of its territory. The Velnorians tried to rally their allies for a counterattack, but the elder species were abandoning them. The Dramani, the faithful servants who had enforced council law for 5,000 years, declared neutrality. The Kishari who had joined the sovereignty years ago revealed intelligence networks that had been feeding information to humanity for decades, Chancellor Vornis watched his civilization crumble from the crystal towers of his homeworld. He sent message after message demanding that the other elder species stand together against the human threat. Most went unanswered. In the end, he had no choice but to surrender. The ceremony took place in the same chamber where Daniel Carter had been sentenced to exile 26 years earlier. The room looked exactly the same, with its rising platforms and its crystalline walls. But the beings who filled it were very different. Daniel stood where he had stood all those years ago. He was 64 now, white-haired and weathered, but he stood straight. And his voice was strong as he addressed the assembly. He announced that the Galactic Council was officially dissolved. In its place, the human sovereignty would establish a new government, one that represented all species equally. There would be no elder species and younger species. There would only be citizens. Vornis stood in the gallery watching. He had been allowed to attend as a witness to the end of everything he had known. His crystalline body seemed even duller than before, as if the defeat had drained the life from him. Daniel looked up at him. For a long moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. Then Daniel spoke. He told Vornis that 26 years ago, the Council had tried to destroy humanity. They had sent humans to die in the darkness because they were afraid of what humanity might become. Daniel paused. He said he wanted to thank Vornis for that. The chamber fell silent. Even Kevin looked surprised. Daniel explained that if the Council had accepted humanity, they would have been absorbed into galactic civilization. They would have adopted Council ways, Council limits, Council fears. They would have become just another species among thousands, never reaching their full potential. Instead, the Council had set them free. Free from traditions that stifled growth, free from rules designed to keep the powerful in control, free to become what they were always meant to be. Vornis said nothing. There was nothing to say. The new government was established over the following months. Daniel was elected first chancellor by a coalition of 30 species, the largest political alliance in galactic history. Kevin took command of the combined military forces. Laura Mitchell, finally ready to rest, retired to a quiet world where she could watch the stars in peace. The transition was not easy. Some worlds resisted the new order. Some species tried to establish their own empires in the chaos. But the sovereignty had learned from the Council's mistakes. They responded with justice, not vengeance. They offered partnership, not subjugation. Ryan Torres, the engineer who had first harnessed RIM energy, lived just long enough to see his technology spread across the galaxy. He died peacefully, surrounded by students who would continue his work. Samantha Blake continued her genetic research, developing treatments that allowed any species to benefit from human enhancements. The Outer Rim, once considered a death sentence, became the most prosperous region in known space. The energy streams that had threatened to destroy humanity now powered civilizations across the galaxy. The worlds that had been considered uninhabitable were transformed into garden planets. 10 years after the fall of the Council, Daniel Carter passed away in his sleep. He was 74 years old. His final words were to Kevin, telling his son to remember why they had built the sovereignty. Not for power, not for revenge, but to create something better than what came before. Kevin honored his father's memory by continuing the work. Under his leadership, the sovereignty grew into a true galactic community. Species that had been enemies for millennia learned to cooperate. Technology advanced faster than ever before. The quality of life for ordinary citizens improved across the board, a century after the exile. Students in academies across the galaxy studied the history of humanity's rise. They debated the causes and consequences. They analyzed the strategies and decisions. They wondered if things could have been different. On Earth, now restored to its former glory as the spiritual capital of the sovereignty, a monument stood in the central plaza. It depicted Daniel Carter on the day of his exile, walking out of the council chamber with his head held high. Behind him were carved the figures of all the others who had built the sovereignty: Lisa, Kevin, Laura, Ryan, Samantha, and thousands more whose names filled the walls of the memorial. The inscription at the base of the monument was simple. It read, "They meant to bury us. They did not know we were seeds. Visitors came from across the galaxy to see it. They came to learn about the species that had turned exile into empire. They came to understand how one promise, made by one man in his darkest hour, had changed the course of galactic history, and somewhere in the stars. The descendants of those first exiles continued to build, to grow, to reach for heights that even Daniel Carter had never imagined. Humanity had found its place among the stars. Not as servants or subjects, but as leaders. Not through conquest, but through perseverance. The Council had been right to fear them. They just had not understood why.